Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has announced the need to send peacekeeping troops to Palestine. This is reported by a source from the administration of the Turkish leader. It is also noted that Turkey and Russia share concern about the escalation of the situation between Israel and Palestine. Erdogan believes that the UN Security Council should step in and prevent the outbreak of a full-scale war. Erdogan noted that it is also necessary to work out the idea of sending international security forces to the region to protect Palestinian civilians. The Turkish president expressed confidence that Ankara and Moscow will cooperate in the UN, the Turkish presidential administration said. Earlier, Putin and Erdogan called for a peaceful solution to the issue in Jerusalem. Turkish President Recep Erdogan has offered to help Vladimir Putin to end the escalating conflict over Jerusalem. And not only to seek the intervention of the UN Security Council. The Turkish leader expressed the idea of sending international security forces to the region to protect Palestinian civilians, as stated in the Turkish side's message about the negotiations. Turkey is the heir to the Ottoman Empire, which 100 years ago owned both Jerusalem and all of Palestine. And Russia is the successor of the Russian Empire, which protected Christians in the Holy Land, and the Soviet Union, which supported the Arabs in their struggle for the creation of a Palestinian state. In the years since the start of our operation in Syria, Russia and Turkey, cooperating and arguing, opposing and finding compromises, have become the most active players in the Middle East. But can they cope with the eternal problem of Jerusalem? And the question of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as a whole, because it is considered in principle unsolvable. And with whom to solve it? Who are the parties to the conflict? It would be even worse if it were just a dispute between Arabs and Jews over the holy city for the three religions, but the struggle for Jerusalem itself is the center, the interweaving of all the most important global contradictions, a symbol of the crisis of the world order. That world order, during the heyday of which the State of Israel was created and the Arab-Israeli conflict began to develop. By taking Palestine from the dying Ottoman Empire, the British encouraged the expansion of Jewish immigration to the Holy Land. The Jews wanted to return to their lost homeland 2,000 years ago. The question of how they would get along with the Arabs there did not concern anyone. It was believed that they would somehow agree after the British left. After the catastrophe of European Jewry during the Second World War, the question of creating two states on the territory of Palestine, Israel and Arab Palestine, became a consensus for the two warring parties, the USSR and the West. But the wars between the Arabs and the Jews that began immediately did not allow the creation of Palestine, and after 1967, when Israel occupied East Jerusalem, which included the Old City, everything became very bad. If earlier, according to the decisions of the UN, Jerusalem was supposed to become a special administrative unit under the control of the international community, now the gradual expansion of Israel has begun, which has decided to take it for itself not only physically, but also legally. The annexation was supposed to close the question of the city's ownership, but until recently, almost no one in the world recognized Jerusalem as Israeli. However, the year before last, it was recognized by the United States, with the reservation that in the future the Palestinian state will have a certain capital in the East Jerusalem suburbs. Trump's plan was rejected by both the Palestinians and the Islamic world as a whole. Both because his proposed new borders of Palestine were a divided sieve, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, riddled with many Israeli enclaves of illegal settlements, and because of the denial of the Arab right to the capital in Jerusalem. The current conflict, by a symbolic coincidence, began on the eve of Al-Quds Day, that is, Jerusalem Day, celebrated by all Muslims on May 7. On the 4th, clashes broke out in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. Israeli police tried to evict several Palestinian families from their homes to give them to Jews. The next day, a 16-year-old Palestinian was shot dead in the West Bank, and on the 7th, clashes broke out on the Temple Mount and the Israeli military stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Not just on the day of Al-Quds, but also at the end of the holy month of Ramadan, it is easy to predict the reaction of the Islamic world to what is happening. The footage of the Jews dancing happily against the background of the fire on the Temple Mount only convinced the Islamic world that Israel wanted to seize and destroy their shrines and build its so-called Third Temple in their place. There were attacks on Israel from the territory of the Gaza Strip. As a result, 5 Israelis were killed, and attacks by the Israeli army on Gaza, more than 50 killed, riots and clashes in cities with mixed populations in Israel itself. Everything is heading for a new intifada, that is, a general uprising of the Palestinians. You can, of course, look for the reasons for the current aggravation in various current reasons. In the internal political crisis in Israel, Netanyahu understands that the upcoming fifth parliamentary elections in 2 years will not change anything, and is ready for a small victorious war in order to turn the situation around in the struggle for power, or in the desire to disrupt the impending return of the United States to the nuclear deal with Iran, provoking Tehran to actively help the Palestinians. But more importantly, the current bloodshed has fundamental, unresolved causes: the lack of a full-fledged Palestinian state and Israel's claim to control historic Jerusalem. Without solving these issues, nothing will change. Small wars will constantly break out, one of which will sooner or later end in a very large war, and not even on a regional scale. The banality of the statement that Jerusalem is the powder magazine of humanity does not mean that you can do nothing and wait until everything resolves itself. By delaying the decision, the world only aggravates the situation. But its resolution would be just a demonstration of the ability of the world powers to negotiate among themselves, if only for the sake of preventing a catastrophe. The main obstacle to a settlement is the fact that the State of Israel is in many respects just a branch of the United States in the Middle East, a globalist-minded part of the American elite, which grew up, among other things, from Puritans. Protestants who considered themselves the new Israel, considers the protection of Israel an absolute priority for America. Hence the absolutely suicidal, in a strategic sense, intransigence of Israel on the Palestinian issue and on Jerusalem. No admonitions even of those Israelis who insist on the absence of an alternative to a peaceful divorce from the Palestinians are taken into account. Israel offers the Palestinians an inferior, dependent, state, and a rejection of Jerusalem, knowing full well that neither will ever be accepted by the Palestinians, nor by the Islamic world as a whole. That is, Israel's only hope is for strength, and not even its own, but the American one. And for endless divorce, that is, attempts to negotiate with individual Arab countries individually on reconciliation. But what will happen when American power weakens, not only in the Middle East, but globally, and this is inevitable in the medium term? What will happen when it becomes impossible to keep the Palestinians in reservations like Gaza? What will happen when the Arab world overcomes the crisis, confusion and vacillation, and gets rid of external influence? The modern Israeli elite does not want to answer these questions, thinking that the force will always be on its side. But the world is rapidly changing and the Atlantic, Anglo-Saxon world order is becoming a thing of the past. If Israel wants to survive in the future, it will have to turn from a Western project into a normal state, peacefully divorce the Palestinians and reconcile with the Arabs. There is no alternative to this. Any delay in resolving the Palestinian issue only makes future military attempts by Muslims to resolve it more bloody, and there is no doubt that they will be. Israel's problems are not with Iran, as they claim in Tel Aviv, but with the $500 million Islamic world, which will never give up Jerusalem. Yes, both Catholics and Orthodox are not indifferent to the fate of the Holy City. The way out of the worsening and increasingly bloody impasse is to look for where it all began, namely, in the resolution on the partition of Palestine, that is, the formation of two states, of the UN General Assembly No. 181 of November 29, 1947. It explicitly stated that the international community would take control of Jerusalem. It was to become a separate entity with a special international regime under the administration of the United Nations. Perhaps the implementation of the old idea will help break the vicious circle of violence and hatred. After all, this is in the interests not only of all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, but also of all civilizations, both Christian and Muslim. Yes, and the whole world, because the new Armageddon will affect both Buddhists and atheists. Not to mention that the rejection of the annexation of Jerusalem will strategically save Israel, although there are still a lot of people who do not want to understand and recognize this. Erdogan's proposal to Putin is currently unworkable, but in the short term, the world community, with the active participation of Russia, should address the problem of Jerusalem before it's too late.